The church doors slammed open, and every head turned, but the man everyone expected to see was not there. Elena Voss stood alone at the altar, her white gown heavy on her shoulders, her hands trembling around a bouquet of pale roses. The priest looked at his watch. The guests began to whisper. Somewhere in the back row, someone laughed, a short, nervous laugh, the kind of laugh people make when they already know something terrible has happened and are afraid to say it out loud. Marcus Hale was 40 minutes late to his own wedding. Elena told herself it was traffic. She told herself it was nerves. She told herself 100 small lies in the space of a single held breath, because the alternative was too painful to admit in front of 300 people who had gathered to watch her become a bride. Her mother sat in the front row, her face pale, her fingers twisting a handkerchief into a tight knot. Her father would not meet her eyes. Then her phone buzzed inside the folds of her gown. She was not supposed to have it with her. It had been her sister's idea, tucked into a hidden pocket, just in case. And Elena had rolled her eyes at the suggestion that morning. Now she reached for it, with shaking fingers, and the entire congregation seemed to hold its breath with her. The message was short. Marcus had never been a man of many words, not even when it mattered most. "I'm sorry. I can't do this. I'm leaving town with Sabrina. Don't wait for me." For a moment, Elena felt nothing at all. The roses slipped from her hands and scattered across the white runner like drops of blood against snow. Sabrina, her best friend since childhood, the woman who had helped her choose this very dress, who had stood beside her at every fitting, who had laughed with her over wine just 2 nights before at the rehearsal dinner, and toasted to forever. The whispers around her grew louder, sharper, crueler. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room, the pity, the shock, the thinly disguised delight of the ones who had always doubted her, who had always said a Voss girl marrying into the Hale line was too good to be true. Pack politics had arranged this marriage long before Elena had any say in it, a union meant to bind 2 territories, 2 bloodlines, 2 futures. Now that future had collapsed in the space of a single text message, and she was the only one left standing in the wreckage. She did not cry. She would not give them that. Instead, Elena turned, lifted the heavy skirt of her gown, and walked back down the aisle the way she had walked in. Except this time, no one was smiling. This time the silence followed her like a shadow, broken only by the click of her heels against the stone floor, and the low murmur of gossip already spreading like fire through dry grass. Outside, the autumn air hit her like a slap. She kept walking. She did not know where. She did not care. The chapel had been built on the border of 2 territories, at the edge of a forest that belonged to no pack in particular, a strip of neutral land where old treaties had once been signed in blood and promises. Elena had visited this place 100 times as a child, had played among these trees before the weight of expectation settled onto her shoulders like a second skin. Now she ran toward it, because it was the only direction that did not lead back to the humiliation waiting behind her. Her heels sank into soft earth. She kicked them off without slowing down. The gown tore against low branches, but she did not stop to check. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs shook, until the sound of the chapel bells faded behind her, and all she could hear was her own ragged breathing and the wind moving through the trees. Finally, she stopped at the edge of a narrow dirt road, gasping, her carefully arranged hair falling loose around her face. Mascara streaked her cheeks, though she had not remembered crying. Her bare feet were cut and cold. She sank down onto a fallen log and pressed her hands against her face, and for the first time since the message had arrived, she allowed herself one single, choked sob. She did not hear the engine at first. Headlights swept across the trees, cutting through the dusk like twin blades of silver light. Elena froze, half expecting to see Marcus's car, some absurd, desperate part of her still hoping this was all some cruel misunderstanding that he had come to correct. But the vehicle that rolled to a stop at the edge of the road was not his. It was a black SUV, sleek and unmarked, the kind of car that belonged to someone who did not need to announce his wealth because everyone already knew it. The door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark suit that fit him with the precision of someone who never wore anything by accident. His dark hair was cut close, his jaw sharp, his eyes an unusual shade of gray that seemed to catch what little light remained in the evening sky. He did not rush toward her. He did not call out or ask if she was all right, in the overly familiar way strangers sometimes did. He simply stood there for a moment, studying her, with an expression Elena could not quite read, somewhere between curiosity and quiet calculation. She recognized him, though she had never spoken to him before. Everyone in the region knew the name Damian Cross. He was the alpha of the Northbound Pack, one of the most powerful and most private leaders in the territory, a man who rarely attended gatherings outside his own lands, and who was rumored to have turned down more marriage proposals from rival packs than anyone could count. People spoke of him in hushed, careful tones, the way one speaks of something that could be either a shield or a blade, depending on which side you stood on. "You're bleeding," he said finally, his voice low and even, nodding toward her feet. Elena looked down. She had not even noticed the cuts, small and shallow, dark against her pale skin. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice cracked on the second word, betraying her. Damian did not move closer, and somehow, that restraint felt more respectful than sympathy would have. "You're a long way from the chapel," he said. It was not quite a question, but it invited an answer. "I don't want to talk about it," Elena said, and pulled her knees up against her chest, as if she could fold herself small enough to disappear. He was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, he crouched down, keeping a careful distance, and set something on the ground beside her. A pair of boots, plain and worn, clearly meant for someone with much larger feet than hers. "They were in the car," he said simply. "For hiking. You can use them until we find you something better." Elena stared at the boots, then at him. "Why are you helping me?" "Because it's cold," he said, "and you're a person, and I happen to be driving by." He straightened, giving her space, not pushing for more than that. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know who you are, Elena Voss. Word travels fast, even out here." Her face burned with fresh shame. Of course he knew. By now, everyone within 100 miles probably knew. She imagined the story already spreading through pack channels, growing more dramatic with every retelling, her humiliation becoming entertainment for people she had never even met. "Then you know I don't need pity," she said, sharper than she intended. Something flickered across his expression, something that might have been the beginning of respect. "I didn't offer any," he said. "I offered boots." Despite everything, despite the ache in her chest and the cold settling into her bones, Elena felt the corner of her mouth twitch, not quite a smile, but close. She pulled the boots on over her torn stockings. They were far too big, but they were warm, and right now that was enough. "I can call someone to take you back," Damian offered. "Or forward, if you'd rather not go back tonight." Elena hesitated. The thought of returning to the chapel, to the whispers, to her mother's pale face and her father's silence, to the empty house she had already half-packed to leave for a life with a man who no longer wanted her, felt unbearable. "I don't know where I'd go," she admitted quietly, the words costing her more pride than she wanted to acknowledge. Damian studied her for a long moment, the gray of his eyes unreadable in the fading light. "Then get in the car," he said. "We'll figure it out from there." She should have said no. Every instinct told her that climbing into a stranger's car on the worst night of her life was not a wise decision, no matter how calm his voice or how careful his manner. But the alternative was sitting alone on a fallen log in a torn wedding gown until the cold became unbearable, and pride alone could not keep her warm. She stood, wincing at the ache in her feet despite the boots, and walked toward the car. Damian opened the passenger door for her without a word, the small courtesy somehow more meaningful than anything Marcus had said to her in the last 6 months of their engagement. As the car pulled away from the dirt road and the trees gave way to open fields under a darkening sky, Elena allowed herself one glance back toward the direction of the chapel, now hidden behind the hills. Somewhere back there, her old life was ending, torn apart in a single cruel message. She did not yet know that the man beside her, quiet and watchful behind the wheel, was about to become the beginning of an entirely different story, one that would demand more courage from her than she had ever needed before, and would test loyalties, bonds, and hearts in ways she could not yet imagine. For now, she simply watched the road unfold ahead of them, the headlights carving a path through the darkness, and allowed herself, for the first time that night, to breathe. "Where are we going?" she finally asked, her voice small in the quiet car. Damian kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel. "Somewhere you can rest," he said. "Tomorrow, you can decide what happens next. Tonight, you don't have to decide anything at all." Elena leaned her head against the cool glass of the window and watched the stars begin to appear over the fields, scattered and distant, indifferent to the wreckage of the evening behind her. She did not know this man. She did not know what waited for her at the end of this road. But for the first time in hours, the tight knot of panic in her chest loosened, just slightly, just enough to let her breathe. Somewhere far behind them, the chapel bells rang one final, mournful note into the night, marking the end of a wedding that had never truly begun. Elena closed her eyes and let the darkness carry her forward, toward a fate she could not yet see, but one that had already begun to take shape the moment a stranger's headlights had cut through the trees. The car climbed a long private road lined with tall pines, and Elena watched the trees blur past in the darkness, until the road opened onto a wide gravel courtyard, in front of a house that could only be described as a fortress. Stone walls rose 3 stories high, dark windows reflecting the moon, iron gates closing behind them with a heavy metallic sound that echoed across the courtyard. This was not a home in the way Elena understood the word. It was a seat of power, built to command respect and, when necessary, to withstand attack. "This is where you live?" she asked, unable to hide the astonishment in her voice. "This is where I work," Damien said, pulling the car to a stop near wide stone steps. "Living is something else entirely." He came around to open her door before she could reach for the handle herself, and Elena stepped out onto the gravel in her borrowed boots, suddenly aware of how strange she must look. A woman in a torn wedding gown, standing in front of the most guarded estate in the region. A few members of his staff appeared at the top of the steps, their expressions carefully neutral, though Elena did not miss the flicker of surprise in their eyes. Damien did not explain her presence to them. He simply said, "Have a room prepared. She'll be staying tonight." His tone left no room for questions, and the staff moved quickly to obey, disappearing back into the house without a word. Inside, the house was as imposing as its exterior suggested, all dark wood and high ceilings, portraits of stern-faced ancestors lining the halls, their painted eyes seeming to follow Elena as she walked past. And yet, there were small signs of warmth scattered throughout: a worn leather chair by a fireplace, a shelf crowded with books that looked well read rather than merely displayed, a faint smell of cedar and rain that seemed to belong to Damien himself. A young woman named Priya showed Elena to a guest room on the 2nd floor, offered her a change of clothes, and left her alone with a promise of tea and a hot bath. Elena sat on the edge of the enormous bed for a long while after the door closed, staring at her own reflection in a tall mirror across the room. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger, hair tangled, makeup smeared, wearing a gown meant for a wedding that would never be finished. She peeled the dress off slowly, careful with the torn lace, and folded it into a bag rather than throwing it away, though she could not have explained why. Some habits of hope die harder than others. The bath, when she finally sank into it, was almost unbearably warm after the cold of the forest, and Elena allowed herself to cry properly for the first time that night, quiet, exhausted tears that had nothing left to prove to anyone. By the time she dressed in the soft clothes Priya had left for her and made her way back downstairs, drawn by the smell of something cooking, it was well past midnight. She found Damien in a small study off the main hall, a fire burning low in the hearth, papers spread across his desk, though he did not appear to be reading them. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "I don't think I remember how," Elena admitted, wrapping her arms around herself despite the warmth of the room. Damien gestured to the chair across from his desk, and after a moment's hesitation, she sat. Neither spoke for a while. The fire crackled softly, throwing shifting shadows across the walls, and Elena found herself studying him in the quiet. The sharp lines of his face softened slightly by the firelight, the exhaustion he tried to hide behind a composed expression. "You never asked me why I stopped," he said eventually. "On the road. I assumed you were just being kind." "I don't stop for many people," Damien said. "Kindness is not usually the reason." He leaned back in his chair, studying her with those pale gray eyes. "I know your family. I know what tonight was supposed to mean, politically. And I know what it means now that it's fallen apart." Elena stiffened. "If you're about to tell me how sorry you are for my humiliation, please don't. I've had enough sympathy to last a lifetime, and it hasn't helped." "I wasn't going to say that." He paused, choosing his next words with obvious care. I have my own complications, Elena. My counsel has been pressuring me for over a year to accept an arranged match with a woman from the Ashford line. It would strengthen a border alliance I don't particularly want, with a family I trust even less. I've refused every proposal they've brought to me, but the pressure isn't going away. I don't understand what that has to do with me. Damien's gaze did not waver. Marry me instead. Tonight, if you're willing. It would resolve both our problems in a single decision. For a moment, Elena simply stared at him, certain she had misheard. You're joking. I don't joke, he said, and the flatness of his tone suggested this was entirely true. You want to marry a woman you found crying in the woods a few hours after she was abandoned at her own wedding, Elena said slowly, testing the absurdity of the words as she spoke them. A woman you've never met before tonight. I want to marry a woman whose family carries real influence, who is clearly intelligent enough to survive tonight with her dignity mostly intact, and who has every reason to want nothing more to do with the man who humiliated her, Damien said. Whatever else you think of me, I am not proposing out of romance. I'm proposing out of necessity, the same necessity that arranged your wedding to Marcus Hale in the first place. The difference is, I'm being honest about it from the very beginning. Elena stood abruptly, pacing toward the fireplace, her mind racing. Every instinct told her this was reckless, impulsive, the kind of decision people regretted for the rest of their lives. And yet, some colder, more practical part of her recognized the shape of the offer for what it was. A way out. A way to walk back into the world, not as a woman who had been discarded, but as a woman who had chosen differently. If I say no, she asked without turning around, what happens to me? Then I'll have Priya arrange transportation wherever you'd like to go in the morning, and we never speak of this again, Damien said simply. There's no obligation here, Elena. I'm not in the business of forcing anyone into anything. She turned to face him. And if I say yes, then by sunrise, you'll be married to the alpha of the northbound pack, and whatever happened tonight in that chapel will matter to no one, because there will be a much larger story for people to talk about instead. A faint, humorless smile touched his mouth. People forget humiliation quickly when there's a scandal to replace it. Elena thought of her mother's pale face, her father's silence, the whispers that would follow her through every gathering for years if she simply crawled back home and let the story stand as it was. She thought of Sabrina's laughter at the rehearsal dinner, knowing even then what she planned to do. She thought of Marcus's message, 4 cold sentences ending 8 years of history. And then she thought of the boots Damien had placed beside her in the dark, without asking for anything in return. I have conditions, she said finally. Something like approval flickered across Damien's face. I'd be disappointed if you didn't. This is a partnership, Elena said, forcing steadiness into her voice. Not a rescue. I won't be a name on a paper who stays quietly in the background while you run your pack. If I'm going to do this, I want a real role, a real voice in this household. Agreed. And there will be no pretending, in private, that this is anything other than what it is, she continued. I won't be lied to again. Not by you, not by anyone in this house. You have my word, Damien said, and something in the steadiness of his gaze made her believe him, despite everything. Elena took a slow breath, feeling the last of her old life settle like ash behind her. Then yes, she said, I'll marry you. Damien rose from his desk, crossing the room to stand before her, close enough now that she could see the faint scar along his jaw, the tiredness beneath his composed exterior. You understand this will move quickly, he said. My counsel will need to see this as decisive, not fragile. We'll marry before dawn, in the old chapel on the estate grounds. It won't be what you imagined for yourself. Nothing about tonight is what I imagined, Elena said quietly. He studied her for a long moment, and for the first time since she had met him, something softened in his expression, not quite warmth, but the absence of the careful distance he had maintained until now. Thank you, he said, for trusting me enough to say yes. Don't thank me yet, Elena said. Ask me again in a year whether I regret it. A ghost of a smile crossed his face, brief but genuine. Fair enough. Within the hour, the household had transformed around her. Priya returned with a simple ivory dress, far less elaborate than the gown Elena had worn earlier that evening, but elegant in its own quiet way. A small chapel on the estate grounds, Little more than stone walls and stained glass windows lit by candlelight was prepared for a ceremony that would have no guests beyond a handful of trusted staff and 2 witnesses summoned from the pack's inner circle. As Elena stood before the small mirror in her borrowed room, watching Priya fasten the last buttons of the dress, she barely recognized the calm settling over her, replacing the panic of hours before. She did not know this man. She did not know what kind of husband he would be, what kind of life awaited her within these stone walls. But for the first time since the wedding bells had tolled behind her in another chapel entirely, she felt something steadier than fear. She felt the beginning of choice. By the time she walked down the narrow aisle of the small stone chapel, candlelight flickering against ancient walls, Damien was waiting for her at the altar, dressed simply now, his expression unreadable, but his eyes steady on hers the entire way. There was no music, no crowd of whispering guests, no roses scattered across white cloth. There was only the quiet certainty of 2 people making a decision, neither fully understood, bound together by circumstance, and, perhaps, something neither of them was yet ready to name. When the brief ceremony ended, and Damien slid a simple band onto her finger, Elena felt the weight of the night finally settle into something like peace. Outside, the first gray light of dawn was beginning to touch the horizon, and somewhere far behind her, in a chapel she would likely never enter again, her old life lay in pieces she no longer needed to gather. She was Elena Cross now, wife to the Alpha King, and whatever waited for her beyond these walls, she would face it with her head held high. The first weeks inside the northbound estate taught Elena that marrying an Alpha King was nothing like the quiet domestic life she had once imagined for herself. Every morning began before sunrise, with Damien already gone from the house, meeting with pack elders, or overseeing border patrols along the northern edge of the territory. Every evening ended late, with reports and maps and tense conversations behind closed doors. Elena had married into power, and power, she quickly learned, never truly rested. She spent her first few days mostly alone, wandering the wide stone halls, learning the names of the staff who moved quietly through the house, memorizing the portraits of Damien's ancestors that lined the corridors like silent judges. She found the library on her 3rd day, a room 2 stories tall, with shelves that seemed to stretch endlessly upward, and it became her refuge whenever the weight of her new life pressed too heavily on her chest. The pack itself was slower to accept her. Word had spread quickly, as Damien predicted it would, of the runaway bride who had married the reclusive Alpha King within hours of being abandoned at her own wedding. Some of the pack whispered that she was desperate, that she had thrown herself at the first powerful man who showed her kindness. Others suggested darker theories, that she was some kind of opportunist, positioning herself for status she had lost when Marcus Hale left her standing at the altar. Elena heard the whispers even when people thought she could not, the low murmurs that stopped abruptly when she entered a room, the sideways glances during pack gatherings, the careful, distant politeness that never quite warmed into genuine welcome. She bore it in silence at first, unwilling to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing how deeply it stung. But the isolation began to wear on her in ways she had not expected. She had grown up surrounded by family, by the comfortable chaos of a pack that had known her since birth. Here, she was a stranger wearing a stranger's name, and no amount of dignity could fill the silence of an empty house during the long hours Damien spent away. It was Priya who first noticed how quiet Elena had become, how she had started taking her meals alone in her room rather than in the main hall, how the light that had briefly returned to her eyes on her wedding night had begun to dim again beneath the weight of unspoken loneliness. "You should tell him," Priya said one afternoon, finding Elena curled in a window seat in the library, a book open but unread in her lap. "Tell him what?" Elena asked, though she already knew. "That it's hard," Priya said simply. "He notices more than he lets on. He's just not always sure what to do with what he notices." Elena considered this for a long moment. "He married me to solve a political problem," she said quietly. "I don't think loneliness was part of the arrangement he expected to manage." "Maybe not," Priya agreed, "but you're his wife now, whatever the reasons behind it. That should count for something." That evening, for the first time since their wedding night, Elena waited for Damien in his study, rather than retreating to her room, before he returned. He arrived later than usual, exhaustion etched into the lines of his face, surprised to find her curled in the leather chair by the fire, with a cup of tea he had not asked for waiting on the desk for him. "You didn't have to wait up," he said, shrugging off his coat. I wanted to, Elena said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that it was true. He sat across from her, studying her face in the firelight, with the same careful attention she remembered from their first conversation. Something's wrong, he said. It was not a question. Elena hesitated, old instincts telling her to deflect, to insist she was fine, to protect her pride the way she always had. But she remembered her own condition, spoken on their wedding night. No pretending. No lies. Not even the small, comfortable ones. I'm lonely, she admitted, the word feeling strange and vulnerable in the quiet room. I know that sounds foolish, given everything else that's happened. I have a roof over my head, safety, a title most people would consider a privilege. But this house is enormous, and you're gone from dawn until nearly midnight most days, and the rest of the pack looks at me like I'm something they haven't decided whether to trust. Damien was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she forced herself not to. I underestimated how difficult this would be for you, he said finally. I've spent so many years building walls around this house, around myself, that I forgot what it feels like to be the one standing outside them. I'm not asking you to change everything about how you run your pack, Elena said quickly. I just needed you to know. No, Damien said, shaking his head slowly. You were right to tell me. I asked you to trust me with the truth. I should have made more effort to earn that trust in return. He paused, something shifting in his expression, a rare openness that Elena had not seen from him before. Walk with me tomorrow. Before the council meetings begin, I'll show you the grounds properly, introduce you to the pack the way I should have from the beginning, not as a political arrangement, but as my wife. Elena felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she had not fully realized she was carrying. I'd like that, she said. True to his word, Damien rose before dawn the next morning, and found Elena already waiting in the courtyard, wrapped against the early chill. He led her across the vast estate grounds, past training fields where young pack members practiced under the watchful eyes of instructors, past the winding stream that marked the eastern boundary of the property, past the small stone chapel where they had married only weeks before. As they walked, Damien spoke more than he had in all their previous conversations combined, telling her about his father, the previous alpha, a hard and unforgiving man who had ruled through fear rather than respect. He told her about his mother, who had died when he was young, and how the loneliness of his childhood had shaped the guarded man he had become. He told her about the betrayal that had left him distrustful of arranged unions in the first place, a woman from his youth who had used his affection to gather information for a rival pack, information that had nearly cost lives before he discovered the truth. That's why I never believed in this, he admitted, as they paused near the edge of the training field, watching the pack members below. Marriage built on anything other than clear-eyed necessity. I told myself feelings only made people vulnerable to exactly the kind of manipulation I experienced. And now? Elena asked quietly. Damien looked at her for a long moment, something unguarded flickering across his face before he could smooth it away. Now I'm not entirely certain what I believe, he said. You've made it difficult to hold on to old certainties. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, unexpected and unwelcome, given how carefully she had tried to guard her own heart since the disaster of her first wedding. I wasn't trying to make anything difficult, she said. I know, Damien said, and something like a genuine smile touched his mouth, brief but real. That might be exactly the problem. From that day forward, small things began to shift between them. Damien made a point of returning earlier when he could, joining her for dinner rather than working through the evening alone in his study. He began introducing her personally to pack members during gatherings, standing close beside her, making it clear, without needing to say so directly, that anyone who disrespected his wife disrespected him in turn. Slowly, cautiously, the whispers around the estate began to soften, replaced by grudging curiosity, and eventually, in small pockets, something like acceptance. Elena, in turn, found herself watching for Damien's return each evening, with an anticipation she was reluctant to name. She learned the rare, small signs that betrayed his moods beneath the composed exterior he showed the world, the tightness around his eyes when negotiations with the council grew difficult, the almost imperceptible relaxation in his shoulders whenever he stepped through the study door and found her waiting there. One evening, several weeks into their arrangement, A sudden storm rolled in from the northern mountains, rain lashing against the tall windows of the estate, thunder rattling the old stone walls. Elena had never enjoyed storms, a fear rooted in a childhood memory of a tree falling near her family home during a similar night, and she found herself unable to settle, pacing the library long after the household had gone quiet. Damien found her there, near midnight, curled into the window seat, watching lightning split the dark sky. "Can't sleep?" he asked, echoing the question she had once asked him. "Storms," Elena admitted, a little embarrassed. "They've never been easy for me." Without a word, Damien crossed the room and settled into the seat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, despite the chill of the room. Neither spoke for a long while, watching the storm rage beyond the glass, and slowly, Elena felt the tightness in her chest begin to ease, simply from the quiet, steady presence beside her. "Thank you," she said eventually, "for staying." "I'm not going anywhere," Damien said, and though his voice remained even, there was something underneath the words, a quiet promise that reached far beyond that single stormy night. Elena turned to look at him, studying the sharp lines of his face, softened by the low light, the intensity in his eyes when he finally met her gaze. Whatever this marriage had begun as, whatever practical necessity had brought them together in the wreckage of her old life, something entirely different was growing quietly between them now. Something neither of them had planned for, and neither of them was entirely certain how to name. "Damien," she said softly, testing the sound of his name in a way she had not before, not as her husband by arrangement, but as something closer to what she was beginning to feel. He did not answer with words. Instead, he reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair from her face, with a gentleness that startled her, given the strength she knew he carried in every other part of his life. Elena did not pull away. She leaned, almost imperceptibly, into the warmth of his hand, and for a long moment, the storm outside seemed to matter far less than the quiet understanding passing between them inside. They did not speak of what had almost happened that night, not directly, but something had shifted permanently in the space between them, an acknowledgement neither was yet ready to voice aloud. Over the following weeks, Elena found herself no longer counting the hours until Damien returned home out of loneliness, but out of something warmer, something she had not expected to feel again after the wreckage of her first engagement. The pack, too, began to notice the change. Elders who had once regarded her with suspicion started seeking her opinion during council discussions, impressed by the sharp intelligence she brought to matters of trade and territory. Younger pack members, drawn by her patience and her genuine interest in their lives, began greeting her warmly during her visits to the training grounds. Slowly, deliberately, Elena was becoming not merely the Alpha's wife, but a respected voice within the northbound pack in her own right. Yet even as her place within the pack solidified, an unspoken tension lingered beneath the surface of her growing bond with Damien. She had married him to escape one form of heartbreak, and though what was growing between them now felt entirely different from the calculated arrangement that had first brought them together, some quiet fear remained lodged in her chest, a fear that history might find a way to repeat itself, that trust, once broken, could never be fully rebuilt without the risk of breaking again. She did not yet know how soon that fear would be tested, nor how far certain forces, both familiar and unfamiliar, were already moving to unravel the fragile peace she and Damien had begun to build together. The autumn gathering was the largest event the northbound pack held each year, a tradition older than Damien's own leadership, drawing members from every corner of the territory to a great hall lit with lanterns and warmed by an enormous central fire. Elena had spent days preparing for it, not out of vanity, but out of a growing sense of responsibility toward the role she now occupied. This gathering would be her first true test, as Luna in front of the entire pack, and she intended to meet it with the same steady composure Damien had shown her time and again. The hall was filled with warmth and noise by the time the ceremony began, laughter and music rising toward the high wooden rafters, the scent of roasted food mingling with wood smoke. Elena stood beside Damien near the great fire, watching the pack gather in loose circles around them, and felt, for the first time since her arrival, a genuine sense of belonging settle over her. The autumn gathering carried an old tradition that Damien had explained to her only briefly beforehand, a ceremonial exchange meant to honor the bond between an alpha and the pack itself, sealed with a simple ritual performed before the fire. Elena had not expected it to feel like anything more than symbolic formality, a public gesture meant to reassure the pack of stability and continuity. She was wrong. The moment Damien took her hand before the assembled crowd, speaking the old words passed down through generations of alphas before him, something shifted deep within her chest, a warmth unlike anything she had felt before, spreading outward from where their hands joined, until it seemed to fill her entire body. She gasped softly, staggering slightly, and Damien's grip on her hand tightened immediately, steadying her, though she could see in his eyes that he felt it too, an equal and mirrored shock passing through him in the same instant. The hall fell silent, every eye turned toward them. An elder near the front of the crowd, a woman named Odalis who had served the pack for longer than Damien had been alive, stepped forward slowly, studying them both with wide, astonished eyes. "The bond," she whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear, spreading in a ripple of astonished murmurs through the crowd. "The true bond has awakened." Elena did not fully understand what was happening, only that something ancient and undeniable had passed between herself and Damien in that single shared moment, a recognition deeper than any words could explain. Later, once the ceremony concluded and they retreated to the relative privacy of the study, Damien tried to explain what she had felt. "It's called a fated bond," he said, pacing slowly before the fire, running a hand through his hair in a rare display of visible unsettlement. "It's rare, rarer than rare, honestly. Most alphas go their entire lives without experiencing it. I never believed it was real, not truly, not until tonight." "What does it mean?" Elena asked, still feeling the lingering warmth of the connection beneath her skin. "It means our connection isn't only a matter of arrangement anymore," Damien said, turning to face her, his gray eyes intense in the firelight. "It means something within both of us recognized the other as a true match, beyond politics, beyond convenience. The old stories say it cannot be forced, and it cannot be faked. It simply is." Elena felt her heart racing, torn between wonder and fear. She had spent so long guarding herself since Marcus's betrayal, careful never to hope for too much, never to trust too completely. And now, here was proof, ancient and undeniable, that whatever she felt for Damien was not merely convenient affection, born of gratitude and proximity, but something far deeper, something that had chosen them both, without permission or warning. "I didn't expect this," she admitted quietly. "Neither did I," Damien said, crossing the room to stand before her. "I spent years telling myself this kind of bond was a story told to comfort the desperate, nothing more. I was wrong." He reached out, taking her hand gently in his. "Elena, whatever began between us out of necessity has become something I no longer wish to question or resist. I don't know how else to say this plainly. I've fallen in love with you, and I don't believe it happened by accident." Tears gathered in Elena's eyes, unexpected and overwhelming. "I love you too," she whispered, the words feeling both terrifying and like the greatest relief she had ever known. "I think I have for weeks now. I just didn't know how to say it, after everything that happened before." Damien drew her into his arms, and for a long moment, neither spoke, simply standing together before the fire, the weight of the ancient bond settling around them, like something sacred and unbreakable. Whatever uncertainty had haunted the early weeks of their marriage dissolved in that embrace, replaced by a quiet, unshakable certainty neither had expected to find again after the losses each of them carried. But even as joy filled the study that night, word of the awakened bond was already spreading far beyond the northbound estate, carried by messengers and gossip alike, toward territories both friendly and hostile. A fated bond between an Alpha King and his Luna was not merely a private matter of the heart. It represented a significant shift in power, a strengthening of the northbound pack's standing that certain rival factions viewed with alarm rather than celebration. Within days, reports began reaching Damien's council of unusual movement along the pack's eastern border, patrols noticing unfamiliar scouts observing their territory from a distance, careful never to cross fully into northbound land, but clearly gathering information nonetheless. Odalis, ever attentive to the old signs, warned Damien directly, during a private council meeting, that news of an awakened fated bond had a long history of drawing dangerous attention, particularly from packs who viewed a strengthened northbound alliance as a direct threat to their own ambitions. Who would move against us over this? Elena asked, when Damien relayed the council's concerns to her later that evening. Several possibilities, Damien admitted grimly. The Ashford line, certainly, given how publicly I refused their proposed alliance in favor of marrying you. Perhaps others as well, Pax, who have long resented the Northbound Territory's influence and would welcome any excuse to challenge it, especially now, while the bond between us is still new and, in their eyes, potentially exploitable. Elena felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her chest, though this time it was mingled with something new. A fierce protectiveness she had not expected to feel so strongly for a pack and a territory that had, only months before, been entirely unfamiliar to her. What can we do? Strengthen our defenses, Damien said. Increase patrols along the border. And be careful, both of us, about who we trust in the coming weeks. If someone intends to exploit this bond against us, they'll look for weakness, wherever they can find it. Elena nodded, steadying herself with the same resolve that had carried her through the worst night of her life, standing alone at an altar in a chapel that no longer mattered to her at all. Whatever threats gathered at the edges of their territory, whatever old resentments and ambitions moved in the shadows beyond the estate walls, she would not allow fear to unravel what she and Damien had built together, not after everything it had cost them both to find it. Over the following days, the Northbound estate transformed subtly, but unmistakably, into something closer to a fortress preparing for conflict. Extra patrols moved along the border at all hours. Damien spent longer stretches away from the house, meeting with allied packs to shore up old alliances and test the loyalty of neighboring territories. Elena, rather than retreating into anxious waiting, threw herself into supporting the pack's preparations, coordinating with Odalis and the other elders to ensure the estate's stores were secure, that message networks between allied territories remained swift and reliable. It was during one of these long, tense evenings, poring over territory maps spread across the study desk, that Elena first heard whispered mention of a name from her past, creeping back into conversations she had thought long finished. Marcus Hale. Priya, delivering a tray of tea to the study, mentioned it almost in passing, careful and hesitant, clearly uncertain whether the information was relevant or wise to share. There's word he's been seen traveling through allied territories recently, she said quietly, asking questions. About the wedding, about you. Elena felt a cold chill settle over her that had nothing to do with the autumn air outside. She had not thought of Marcus in weeks, had allowed herself the relief of believing that chapter of her life was fully closed, replaced by something far better and far more real. The idea that he might be circling back into her life now, at the exact moment when the pack's stability hung delicately in the balance, filled her with a wariness she had not felt in a long time. What could he possibly want, she asked, though some quiet, unwelcome part of her already suspected the answer. Damien's expression darkened as he looked up from the maps. Whatever it is, he said, we'll be ready for it, together. Elena met his eyes across the desk, drawing strength from the steady certainty she found there, and nodded. Whatever storm was gathering on the horizon, whether from rival packs testing the strength of their newly awakened bond, or from a familiar face returning to unsettle a peace she had only just begun to trust, she would not face it as the woman who had once stood alone and abandoned at an altar. She would face it as Luna of the Northbound pack, bonded by something ancient and unbreakable, to a man who had chosen her, fully and completely, in return. Marcus Hale arrived at the edge of Northbound territory on a gray morning, 3 weeks after word of his wanderings first reached Elena's ears. He did not come alone. Beside him rode a small envoy from the Ashford line, a pairing that told Damien everything he needed to know about the true purpose behind the visit before a single word had been exchanged. Elena watched from a high window of the estate as the small party was escorted through the gates, her stomach twisting into a knot she had not felt since the night of her ruined wedding. Marcus looked much the same as she remembered, though something in his posture had changed, a nervous energy replacing the easy confidence he had once carried so effortlessly. Beside him rode a woman Elena did not recognize, sharp-featured and elegantly dressed, watching the estate grounds with the calculating eyes of someone assessing a battlefield rather than admiring a home. That's Vivian Ashford, Damien said grimly, joining Elena at the window. The council's preferred candidate for the alliance I refused. It seems she's decided to pursue other avenues to weaken our position. And Marcus? Elena asked, though she feared she already understood. A convenient tool, Damien said. Someone with a personal grievance and enough foolish pride to be useful to people far more dangerous than himself. They received the envoy in the Great Hall, rather than the private study, a deliberate choice on Damien's part to ensure witnesses remained present throughout the exchange. Elena stood beside him, chin lifted, refusing to allow even a flicker of the old humiliation to show on her face, as Marcus was led into the hall. "Elena," Marcus said, his voice carrying an uncomfortable mixture of false warmth and genuine nervousness. "You look well." "I am well," Elena said evenly. "Married, in fact, to a man who did not leave me standing alone in front of 300 guests." A flush crept up Marcus's neck, but Vivian Ashford stepped forward before he could respond, her smile sharp and practiced. "We come with concerns," she said smoothly, addressing Damien directly. "Concerns shared, I believe, by several territories, regarding the sudden and rather convenient awakening of a fated bond, so soon after your public refusal of the alliance our families had long discussed." "Convenient," Damien repeated, his tone deceptively mild. "Are you suggesting the bond isn't genuine, Lady Ashford?" "I'm suggesting," Vivian said, "that a great many things can be arranged to appear genuine, when the stakes are high enough. My counsel would find it reassuring to have the matter examined more closely, perhaps by a neutral elder council, before recognizing the political weight such a bond implies." Elena felt anger rise sharp and hot in her chest, but she held her tongue, watching Damien carefully. He did not raise his voice, did not betray even a flicker of the fury Elena suspected simmered beneath his composed exterior. "You're welcome to bring your concerns before the full elder council," Damien said calmly. "Odalys has already confirmed the bond's authenticity, and her judgment carries weight across every allied territory in this region, including, I believe, your own family's lands. I doubt further examination will produce a different answer, but you're free to seek it." Vivian's smile faltered slightly, clearly having expected either capitulation or open hostility, neither of which Damien offered. Marcus, meanwhile, had been watching Elena throughout the exchange with an expression she could not quite decipher, something between regret and desperate calculation. "Elena," he said suddenly, stepping forward despite Vivian's sharp glance in his direction. "Could we speak privately? Just for a moment?" Elena hesitated, glancing at Damien, who gave the smallest nod, trusting her judgment, though she could see the tension in his jaw at the request. "Fine," she said. "A moment, nothing more." They stepped into a small antechamber off the Great Hall, Marcus closing the door behind them, with visible reluctance, as though even he understood how precarious his position had become. For a long moment, neither spoke. "I made a mistake," Marcus said finally. "Leaving you the way I did. Sabrina and I, it fell apart within weeks. I should never have listened to her, should never have let myself be talked into believing something better waited for me elsewhere." "You didn't just leave," Elena said, her voice steady, despite the old ache stirring beneath his words. "You humiliated me in front of everyone who mattered to me, in the cruelest way you could have chosen, and you did it without even the courage to say it to my face." "I know," Marcus said, and to his credit, he did not attempt to defend the indefensible. "I've regretted it every day since. When I heard you'd married the Alpha King, I told myself it was only politics, that you couldn't possibly feel anything real for a man you'd known less than a single night. I convinced myself I still had a chance to make things right between us." "There is no us, Marcus," Elena said firmly. "There hasn't been since the moment I read your message in that chapel. Whatever you thought you might find here today, it isn't waiting for you." Something hardened in Marcus's expression, the regret giving way to something more bitter. "Vivian says the bond can be broken," he said quietly. "If enough doubt is cast on its legitimacy before the wider council, if enough allied pacts question whether it was manufactured to strengthen Northbound's political position, it could unravel the entire alliance Damien's built around it." Elena felt a cold chill settle over her. "Is that why you're really here? Not for me at all, but to help her tear apart something you have no right to touch." "I told myself I was here for you," Marcus admitted, something like shame flickering across his face. "But I won't lie to you again, not after everything. Vivian offered me a place in the Ashford territory, a fresh start, in exchange for helping cast doubt on the bond's legitimacy. I came here telling myself it was about winning you back. I think, if I'm honest, it was always more about proving to myself that I hadn't lost everything that mattered by leaving you the way I did. Elena studied him for a long moment, feeling something close to pity mingled with her lingering anger. Whatever damage Marcus had caused, whatever role he had played in Vivienne's schemes, he seemed, in this moment, more lost than dangerous. A man scrambling to reclaim some sense of purpose after his own choices had unraveled around him. "Go home, Marcus," she said finally. "Whatever you're looking for, you won't find it here, and you won't find it by helping Vivienne Ashford tear apart something real, out of spite for something you never truly valued while you had it." She turned and left the antechamber without waiting for his response, returning to the great hall, where Damien stood watching the door with barely concealed tension, relaxing visibly the moment she reappeared unharmed. "He's not the true threat," Elena said quietly, once they had withdrawn to the privacy of the study. "Vivienne is using him, the same way she's trying to use doubt and rumor to weaken us before the wider council. Marcus is desperate and foolish, but I don't believe he came here with any real plan beyond his own confused regrets. Vivienne's threat is real enough on her own," Damien said grimly. "If she manages to convince even a handful of allied territories to question the bond's legitimacy, it could weaken our standing significantly, right at the moment when several rival pacts are already testing our borders." "Then we don't give her room to plant that doubt," Elena said, a plan already forming in her mind. "Call the full Elder Council together. Let Odalise confirm the bond publicly, before every territory, allied and rival alike. Don't leave room for rumor to take root in silence." Damien studied her for a long moment, something like admiration crossing his features. "You're certain?" "I spent months being talked about in whispers I couldn't answer," Elena said firmly. "I won't make that mistake again. If Vivienne wants to challenge us, let her do it in the open, where the truth can actually defend itself." Within days, messengers carried word across every allied and neighboring territory, summoning representatives to a full council gathering at the Northbound estate, an event significant enough to draw even the most distant and cautious of allied pacts. Vivienne Ashford, unable to refuse the summons without appearing to concede the very legitimacy she sought to question, arrived alongside representatives from a dozen other territories. The great hall filled once again, though this time with far more at stake than a simple wedding gathering. Odalise stood before the assembled council, her voice carrying the authority of decades spent studying the old traditions few others still fully understood. She spoke of the fated bond's signs, the shared physical response, the ancient words that could not be spoken falsely without immediate and unmistakable consequence. Consequences she herself had witnessed firsthand on the night of the autumn gathering. One by one, she addressed every doubt Vivienne had attempted to plant, dismantling each with the calm, unshakable certainty of someone who had devoted her life to understanding exactly this kind of bond. When Odalise finished, she turned to Vivienne directly. "If Lady Ashford still doubts the authenticity of this bond," she said, "I invite her to submit to the same ceremonial test herself, alongside any candidate of her choosing, so the council might witness firsthand the difference between a manufactured claim and a true awakening." Vivienne's composure finally cracked under the weight of the assembled council's attention. She had no true fated match to offer as proof, no genuine claim to counter what Odalise had just demonstrated so thoroughly. Murmurs of disapproval rippled through the gathered representatives, several allied territories exchanging pointed glances that made clear exactly how they viewed her attempt to sow discord within a legitimately bonded union. "This council has heard enough," announced one of the eldest representatives present, a woman from a distant southern territory who had remained silent throughout most of the proceedings. "Whatever grievance the Ashford line holds regarding a refused alliance, it does not grant the right to spread false doubt about a bond this council has now witnessed, confirmed beyond reasonable question." Vivienne, recognizing the tide had turned decisively against her, offered a stiff, insincere apology before withdrawing from the hall with her envoy, Marcus, trailing behind her, with an expression of quiet defeat. Elena watched him go, feeling not triumph, but a quiet, settled closure, the final thread connecting her to her old life finally severed, not through anger, but through the simple, undeniable truth of what she had built since. As the council gathering dispersed and the great hall slowly emptied, Damien drew Elena aside, his expression a mixture of relief and something warmer, something that had grown steadily since the night of the autumn gathering. "You saved us today," he said quietly. "Not just the Alliance. The truth of what we have. We saved it together," Elena corrected gently. "That's what partnership means, isn't it?" Damien smiled, real and unguarded, drawing her close despite the lingering presence of departing council members throughout the hall. "It is," he said. "And I intend to spend a long time proving I understand exactly how fortunate I am to have found it with you." Yet even as peace settled once more over the northbound estate, whispers persisted at the edges of the territory, quiet reports of continued movement from packs still resentful of the Alliance's growing strength. Vivian Ashford's public humiliation had ended one threat, but Elena and Damien both understood that the fragile peace they had fought to protect remained far from fully secure, and that the true test of everything they had built together might still lie ahead. Winter settled early over the northbound territory that year, bringing with it a cold that seemed to seep into the very stones of the estate, and with it, the first true test of everything Elena and Damien had built since the night of the council gathering. Word arrived one bitter morning from a border patrol, breathless and urgent, that armed scouts from a coalition of rival territories had crossed into northbound land under cover of the previous night's storm, moving swiftly toward one of the smaller outlying settlements under the Pack's protection. Damien was already moving before the messenger finished speaking, calling for his senior guard, pulling maps from the study shelves with the swift, practiced efficiency of a man who had trained his entire life for exactly this moment. Elena followed close behind, refusing the suggestion, gently offered by Priya, that she remain safely within the main estate while the crisis unfolded. "I won't hide behind these walls while people I've come to know are in danger," Elena said firmly, already reaching for her coat. "Tell me what I can do." Damien paused, studying her for a brief moment amid the chaos of preparation, something like pride flickering across his tense expression. "Coordinate the eastern relay stations," he said finally. "Keep our allied territories informed in real time. If this coalition believes they can strike us while we're divided, we need every ally we have responding swiftly, not scrambling to catch up after the fact." Elena nodded, moving immediately to the study's communication room, where a network of trusted messengers and swift riders stood ready to carry word across the territory's borders. For the next several hours, she worked without pause, relaying reports, coordinating with allied packs whose representatives had witnessed the council gathering weeks before and now moved quickly to honor the alliances reaffirmed that day. The attack, when it came in full, was swift and coordinated, a clear attempt by a loose coalition of rival packs, quietly encouraged by the Ashford line's lingering resentment, to test the northbound pack's strength, while the fated bond's legitimacy still felt, to outside eyes, relatively new, and potentially exploitable. Damien led his guard personally to the outlying settlement, and reports trickling back to the estate throughout the long, tense afternoon spoke of fierce but controlled resistance, the settlement's own defenders holding firm until reinforcements arrived. Elena remained at the estate, her stomach twisted into knots of worry. She refused to let show in front of the staff and remaining pack members, counting on her steady presence to maintain calm within the main household. She thought, more than once during those long hours, of the night she had first met Damien, a stranger who had stopped his car in the darkness to offer boots and quiet kindness to a woman he owed nothing. She had not known then how deeply her life would become entwined with his, how completely she would come to care for the outcome of a conflict that, months ago, would have had nothing to do with her at all. By nightfall, word finally arrived that the coalition's forces had been repelled, the settlement secured, casualties mercifully light thanks to the swift response Elena had helped coordinate from the estate. Damien returned near midnight, exhausted, a shallow cut along his temple, the only visible mark of the day's conflict, and Elena met him at the courtyard steps before he had even fully dismounted, relief flooding through her at the sight of him whole and safe. "It's over?" she asked, searching his face. "For now," Damien said, weariness evident in every line of his posture. "We captured several of their scouts, enough, I think, to trace this back clearly to the coalition backing it, and enough to bring the matter before the full council with undeniable proof of aggression against northbound territory." Over the following days, as Damien met with his council to determine the appropriate response, Evidence gathered from the captured scouts confirmed exactly what both of them had suspected. The coalition's attack had been quietly funded and encouraged by remnants of the Ashford Line's ambitions, still smarting from their public humiliation at the earlier council gathering, seeking through force what they had failed to achieve through doubt and rumor. The full council convened once more at the northbound estate, this time to address open aggression rather than mere questions of legitimacy. Vivian Ashford did not attend personally this time, having apparently recognized the impossibility of defending her family's involvement before an assembly already primed to view her with suspicion. Instead, her father, the elder Ashford patriarch, arrived to answer for his territory's actions, his expression grim and resigned, even before the proceedings began. Damien presented the evidence methodically, without theatrics, allowing the captured scout's own testimony and the physical evidence gathered from the attack to speak for itself. Elena stood beside him throughout, no longer the uncertain outsider she had been at her first council gathering months before, but a recognized and respected voice within the Northbound Pack's leadership. Her calm, clear input during the proceedings, earning nods of approval from allied representatives who had come to know her steady judgment over recent months. When the evidence had been fully presented, the assembled council reached its verdict swiftly and without significant dissent. The Ashford territory would face severe sanctions, its trade privileges suspended, its standing among allied packs diminished for a period no less than 3 years, with the possibility of longer consequences should further evidence of continued aggression surface. Vivian herself, stripped of any future claim to leadership within her own territory, would answer directly to her family's council for the consequences her ambitions had brought upon them all. As the council gathering drew to its close, Odalise rose once more before the assembled representatives, her expression carrying a warmth Elena had not seen from the elder before. "Before this council disperses," she said, "I believe it fitting that we properly honor the union this territory has fought so hard to defend these recent months. The bond between Alpha Damien and Luna Elena was confirmed before us weeks ago, but confirmation is not the same as celebration. I propose a true ceremony, witnessed fully by this council and the pack at large, to properly honor what circumstance first brought together, and what genuine devotion has since transformed into something unbreakable." The proposal was met with warm approval throughout the hall, and Elena felt tears gather unexpectedly in her eyes as she glanced toward Damien, finding the same emotion mirrored in his own gaze. Their first wedding, hurried and pragmatic, born of necessity in the darkest hours following her humiliation, had never truly been the celebration either of them deserved. This, finally, would be different. The ceremony took place 3 weeks later, once winter's harshest edge had softened slightly, and the estate grounds could be properly prepared for a gathering unlike anything the northbound territory had seen in generations. Unlike the quiet, hurried vows spoken in the small stone chapel on their first night together, this ceremony unfolded before the entire assembled pack and representatives from every allied territory, filling the great hall and spilling out into the courtyard beyond, decorated with winter roses and strings of warm lantern light against the early evening sky. Elena stood before a mirror in her old guest room, now fully her own, as Priya carefully fastened the final clasps of a gown, far more elaborate than the simple ivory dress she had worn months before, though nothing at all like the gown she had worn on that first, disastrous wedding day. This dress had been made specifically for her, deep winter blue, threaded with silver, reflecting not the life she had once expected for herself, but the one she had built through courage, resilience, and an unexpected, undeniable bond with a man she had once known only as a stranger, with headlights cutting through a dark forest. "Are you nervous?" Priya asked, adjusting the final fold of fabric. Elena studied her own reflection for a long moment, hardly recognizing the composed, confident woman looking back at her, so different from the devastated bride who had fled through the trees all those months ago. "No," she said finally, surprised by how true the answer felt. "I've never been more certain of anything." The great hall had been transformed entirely for the occasion, the ancient portraits along the walls now framed with garlands of winter greenery, the enormous central fire blazing warm and bright against the evening chill. As Elena walked down the aisle formed by the assembled crowd, she found no whispers of pity or doubt following her steps this time, only warm smiles and approving nods from pack members who had, over long months, come to know and respect her in her own right. Damien waited at the front of the hall, dressed formally for the first time since their brief, hurried first wedding, his gray eyes fixed on hers, with an intensity that made the distance between them feel far too long despite the short walk. When she finally reached him, he took her hands in his, and Elena felt again that same ancient warmth from the autumn gathering ceremony, familiar now rather than startling, a steady confirmation of everything they had built together. Odalis presided over the ceremony herself, speaking words far more elaborate than the simple vows exchanged in the small chapel months before, weaving together the old traditions of the pack, with an acknowledgement of everything Elena and Damien had overcome to reach this moment. When Damien spoke his vows, his voice carried none of the guarded distance she remembered from their first meeting, only open, unguarded devotion. "I did not believe in fate," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "I built my life around the certainty that trust, once broken, could never be fully rebuilt, that love was a vulnerability I could not afford as alpha of this pack. You proved me wrong in every way I once thought impossible. You did not simply become my wife by circumstance, Elena. You became the truest partner I have ever known, the steadiest presence in every storm this territory has weathered since the night I found you in that forest. I promise you now, before our entire pack and the allies who stand with us, that whatever challenges still lie ahead, I will face them beside you, not merely as your alpha, but as the man who loves you completely." Elena, her voice trembling slightly with emotion, she no longer felt any need to hide, spoke her own vows in return. "I came to you broken," she said, "abandoned by someone who never truly valued what he had, certain I would never again trust anyone with my heart. You did not ask me to forget that pain, Damien. You simply showed me, day after day, that trust could be rebuilt, patiently and honestly, without demanding I pretend the past had never happened. I love you not despite the circumstances that brought us together, but because of everything we chose to build from them. I promise to stand beside you, as your wife, your partner, and your equal, for as long as this bond holds us together, which I believe, now, will be for the rest of our lives." When Odalis pronounced them fully and truly bonded before the pack, the great hall erupted into celebration, unlike anything Elena had witnessed since her arrival, music and laughter filling the space long into the night, allied representatives from every territory, raising their voices in genuine celebration, rather than the cautious, watchful politeness that had marked so many earlier gatherings. Elena danced with Damien before the roaring fire, surrounded by a pack that had, slowly and deliberately, become her own true family, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, complete and unreserved joy. Later that evening, as the celebration continued around them, Damien drew her briefly away from the crowd, out onto a quiet balcony overlooking the moonlit training grounds, where she had first watched him introduce her properly to his pack months before. The cold night air was sharp and clear, stars scattered brilliantly across the winter sky. "Do you remember what I told you, that first night in the forest?" Damien asked quietly, drawing her close against the chill. "You said I didn't have to decide anything that night," Elena said, smiling at the memory. "That tomorrow, I could decide what happened next." "I think," Damien said, "that tomorrow turned out better than either of us could have imagined." Elena leaned into him, watching the stars scattered above the territory they had fought so hard to protect together. The pack they had built into something stronger than either of them could have achieved alone. Whatever challenges still waited beyond the estate's walls, whatever future trials their bond might yet face, she knew now, with a certainty that no rumor or rival could ever fully shake, that she would face them exactly as she stood now, not as a woman abandoned and broken, but as Luna of the Northbound pack, bonded forever, to a man who had chosen her completely, in every sense that mattered. Below them, the celebration continued long into the winter night, laughter and music rising warm against the cold, a pack united, a bond confirmed beyond any doubt, and a future neither of them had once dared to imagine, now finally, fully theirs. Spring came slowly to the Northbound territory that year, the last patches of snow lingering stubbornly in the shadowed corners of the estate grounds, long after the training fields had turned green again. Elena had grown used to the rhythm of her new life by then, the early mornings spent reviewing trade reports with Damien, the afternoons spent walking the grounds with Odalis, learning slowly the deeper traditions of the pack she now called her own. The council's sanctions against the Ashford territory remained firmly in place, and for months, the borders had stayed quiet. The coalition that had once tested Northbound's strength scattered and weakened by their failed campaign. It was during this season of quiet, when Elena had finally allowed herself to believe the worst dangers had passed, that Priya came to her one afternoon with a troubled expression Elena had rarely seen on the younger woman's usually calm face. "There's something you should know," Priya said, glancing carefully toward the study door before lowering her voice. "One of the newer kitchen staff, a man named Callum, hired only a few months ago during the winter preparations. I noticed him near the private wing late last night, somewhere he had no reason to be." Elena felt a familiar wariness settle over her, the same instinct that had once told her not to trust the easy warmth of a rehearsal dinner toast. "Did you ask him about it?" "He said he'd gotten lost," Priya said. "But Elena, he was near the study, exactly where Damien keeps the correspondence with Allied territories. And this morning, one of the stable hands mentioned Callum had been asking unusual questions about the patrol schedules along the eastern border." Elena did not dismiss the concern, though she was careful not to act rashly on it either. She had learned enough in her time as Luna to understand that accusations without evidence could do as much damage as the threats they were meant to prevent. Instead, she brought the matter quietly to Damien that evening, and together, they arranged for a discreet watch to be kept on the man in question, careful not to alert him to their suspicion. Within a week, the careful watch bore fruit. Callum was observed meeting secretly with a rider near the edge of the estate grounds late one night, exchanging a small sealed letter, before the rider disappeared quickly back toward the eastern border. Damien's guard intercepted the rider before he could cross fully out of Northbound territory, and the letter, once opened, revealed exactly what Elena and Damien had feared. Callum had been quietly gathering information for months, not for the Ashford line directly, but for a smaller, more desperate faction of the scattered coalition, remnants who had fled the earlier conflict and now sought any advantage that might allow them to strike again before Northbound's defenses could fully recover. Callum was brought before Damien and a small council of trusted advisors, rather than punished hastily in anger. Elena insisted on this, remembering too well how quickly whispered accusations had once threatened to unravel her own place within the pack, and Damien, respecting her judgment, agreed that fairness mattered, even when dealing with genuine betrayal. Under careful questioning, Callum's resolve crumbled quickly. He was not, it turned out, a hardened agent of sabotage, but a desperate young man from a struggling border village who had been offered payment he could not refuse to help support a family, struggling through a difficult winter, with little understanding of how deeply his information might endanger the pack that had, however unknowingly, given him honest work and shelter in return. "I never wanted anyone hurt," Callum said, his voice shaking as he stood before the council. "I only wanted enough to keep my family fed through the season. I didn't think it would matter. Small pieces of information here and there. I didn't understand how it could be used." Elena watched Damien carefully as he considered the young man's confession, remembering the fierce, protective anger she had seen in him during the earlier conflict, wondering whether that same fury would now be turned against a man who, however foolishly, had acted out of desperation rather than true malice. Instead, Damien's response surprised her. "Desperation makes fools of good people," he said finally, "and I won't pretend Northbound's own oversight in verifying your circumstances before hiring you didn't play a part in creating the opportunity for this mistake." He paused, studying Callum's frightened face. "You'll be dismissed from your position here, and you'll provide full details of everyone you communicated with, so we can properly address the remaining threat. But your family will not go hungry for your foolishness. I'll see to it personally that support reaches your village, on the condition that nothing like this happens again." Callum, clearly stunned by the mercy shown him, agreed readily, providing every detail he could recall about the faction that had recruited him. The information proved invaluable, allowing Damien's forces to move swiftly and decisively against the remaining coalition remnants before they could organize any further action against the territory, dismantling the threat entirely within a matter of weeks, this time without any conflict at all. Elena found Damien later that evening in the study, the same room where he had first proposed their unlikely marriage so many months before, staring thoughtfully into the fire rather than reviewing the reports spread across his desk. "You showed him mercy," she said, settling into the chair across from him. I wasn't certain you would. You taught me that, Damien said, looking up at her with the same warmth that had grown steadily between them since that first storm they had weathered together in the library. You once told me trust could be rebuilt, patiently and honestly. I don't think that lesson should only apply to the people I choose to love. It should apply to how I lead this pack as well. Elena smiled, crossing the room to sit beside him rather than across from him, the old formality of their early days together, long since replaced by an easy, comfortable closeness neither had expected to find so completely. Northbound is fortunate to have an alpha who understands the difference between strength and cruelty, she said. Most rulers never learn it at all. They sat together for a long while in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn low, the estate around them finally settling into the kind of true peace neither had dared to hope for during those tense, uncertain early months of their marriage. Elena thought back often, in quiet moments like this, to the night she had stood alone in a forest clearing, abandoned and broken, certain her life had reached its lowest possible point. She could not have imagined then how far that single devastating night would carry her, toward a partnership built not on the desperate arrangement it had begun as, but on genuine, hard-won trust and love that had weathered every storm thrown against it since. Odalise visited the estate one final time that spring, bringing with her news that the wider council, impressed by how decisively and fairly Northbound had handled both the coalition's aggression and the quiet threat of Callum's betrayal, had begun formally recognizing Damien and Elena's leadership as a model for how other territories might handle similar disputes in the future. The Ashford line's influence continued to diminish steadily, its sanctions serving as a clear warning to any other territory tempted to challenge Northbound's strength through deception rather than honest negotiation. You've built something remarkable here, Odalise told Elena privately, as they walked together through the training fields one warm spring afternoon, the pack's youngest members practicing nearby, under the watchful guidance of their instructors. Not merely a strong pack, but a just one. That distinction matters more than most alphas ever learn to understand. I couldn't have built any of it alone, Elena said honestly. It took every person in this pack willing to trust something new, even after everything that came before. Perhaps, Odalise said, smiling knowingly, but it took a particular kind of courage to walk back into trust after being so thoroughly betrayed by it once already. That courage began with you, Elena, the night you chose to climb into a stranger's car rather than let despair decide your future for you. Elena considered those words often in the seasons that followed, watching the Northbound territory continue to flourish under careful, balanced leadership, watching her own place within the pack grow steadily, from cautious acceptance into genuine, deep respect. The whispers that had once followed her through every gathering had long since faded, replaced by the quiet confidence of a pack that had watched their Luna prove herself, again and again, not through desperate defensiveness, but through patient strength and unwavering fairness. On a warm evening many months after the winter ceremony that had properly bound them before the entire pack, Elena stood once more at the edge of the training fields, watching the sun set golden and warm over the territory she now called home completely. Damien found her there, as he so often did, drawing her gently against him as they watched the light fade slowly across the hills. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly, echoing a question he had asked her once before, in the earliest, most uncertain days of their unlikely marriage. Elena thought of the chapel she had fled from that autumn night, of the humiliation and heartbreak that had once seemed like the ending of everything she had hoped for. She thought of the boots left quietly beside her in the dark, the storm weathered together in the library, the ancient bond awakened before the fire, the challenges faced and overcome, together, every single time. None, she said, and meant it completely, not one. Above them, the first stars began to appear over the Northbound territory, steady and constant against the deepening sky, marking not an ending, but the quiet, hopeful beginning of everything still waiting ahead for the family they had built together, out of heartbreak, out of courage, and out of a love neither of them had ever expected to find, yet had come, in the end, to trust completely.